In every generation, there comes a crime so disturbing, so incomprehensible, that it forces a nation to stop and ask itself how such darkness could grow unnoticed. This is one of those stories. A story of vulnerability. A story of trust. A story of a young man who slipped into the company of people who did not care if he lived or died. This is the story of Sam Nordquist. Tonight, we're going to look not only at what happened during the final month of his life, but also at the systems, the warning signs, and the unanswered questions that still haunt investigators and the public. This is part one of a three-part deep dive into one of 2025's most shocking and heartbreaking crimes. Let's begin. Before we talk about what happened to Sam, we need to understand who he was. Sam Nordquist was a 27-year-old transgender man living in Minneapolis. By all accounts, Sam was funny, vibrant, gentle. Someone who lit up the room in a quiet way. He was close with his mother. He loved animals. He loved art. He was the kind of person who carried softness in a world that often rewards hardness. Friends described him as someone who was trying to rebuild his life one day at a time. But like many people trying to find stability, Sam sometimes trusted the wrong people. And the wrong people sometimes notice. In early 2025, Sam became connected with individuals in the Minneapolis area whose names later surfaced in police statements and news reports. To avoid defamation, and because this case involves ongoing legal processes, we're not going to speculate about guilt or intent. Instead, we will focus strictly on what has been publicly reported and what investigators say they believe may have happened during that final month. What we can say is this: Sam ended up staying in a home with several adults. And according to allegations later described by prosecutors, it was inside this home that Sam endured what authorities believe was a prolonged and horrific period of physical abuse. Investigators later said that Sam was not free to leave. He wasn't safe, and he wasn't being helped. One of the most chilling elements of this case is not just the violence Sam endured, but how long it allegedly went on. Authorities believe Sam may have been held in the house for over a month. 30 days. 30 nights. During that time, reports suggest he suffered a level of mistreatment almost impossible to imagine. And the question that keeps surfacing is this: how did no one know? How did an entire month go by with a vulnerable young man trapped in a house? And no one came for him. Turns out, someone did ask for help, just not fast enough. In late March, around the time investigators now believe Sam was being abused, his mother became extremely worried. She hadn't heard from him. She knew something felt wrong. So she did what any desperate mother would do. She called the police. She asked for a welfare check. This is where the story takes one of its most painful, difficult turns, and where public outrage later reached a boiling point. Because according to later reporting, officers went to the house. They knocked. No one answered. And then, they left. The welfare check was marked as complete. But Sam was still inside, alive, suffering, waiting for help that didn't come. Let's talk about the house itself. Not the exact address. We're not here to encourage harassment or vigilante behavior, but the environment. Neighbors later told reporters that the home had issues. People came and went at unusual hours. There were screams sometimes, though no one knew from whom. Most chalked it up to arguments, drug use, or personal disputes. A lot of people mind their own business now. Maybe too much. The house was barely maintained. Windows were covered. The yard was a mess. If a house can speak, this one whispered one thing: something is wrong here. Inside this home, according to prosecutors, members of the household inflicted injuries on Sam that ultimately led to his death. Again, we are not stating guilt as fact. These claims remain allegations until proven in court. But what investigators later described goes far beyond a single moment of violence. It was sustained. It was cruel. And it happened behind walls no one looked behind long enough. Near the end of April 2025, someone in the house finally called 911. Sam was unconscious, not breathing. When medical responders arrived, they found Sam with injuries that immediately raised red flags. Injuries inconsistent with an accident, inconsistent with a single fight, inconsistent with anything except prolonged and severe abuse. Sam was transported to a nearby hospital. But he didn't make it. Sam Nordquist died on April 26, 2025, just 27 years old. His death certificate would later list the cause of death as complications from extensive physical trauma. Police quickly obtained warrants. Statements were taken. Several individuals were arrested and charged with offenses ranging from kidnapping to murder, depending on the person. Again, legal outcomes will be determined by courts, not by us. But the world was left with one undeniable truth. Sam should still be alive. News of Sam's death spread fast, not just because of the brutality of the alleged abuse, but because of the larger context. Sam was a transgender man, and many activists and advocates emphasized a harsh reality. Transgender people face higher rates of violence, homelessness, exploitation, and barriers to safety. Sam's story immediately resonated across LGBTQ+ communities nationwide. People saw in Sam not just a victim, but a symbol of how systems fail people who need protection. Protests formed. Memorials appeared. Community leaders called for investigations into how the welfare check had been handled. How could an officer walk away from a house where someone was actively being tortured? Why weren't deeper steps taken? Why wasn't a second check ordered when Sam's mother continued expressing fear? Questions flooded the city. Anger boiled over, and Sam's mother was left in unimaginable grief. In part 1 of the series, we've looked at the timeline leading up to Sam's death. But here is the hardest, most painful truth. Almost every stage of Sam's final month contained an opportunity for intervention. A welfare check that came too late. A house full of red flags. A system that often struggles to protect vulnerable adults. But as heartbreaking as all of this is, the story doesn't end here. In fact, some of the most shocking revelations, the interrogation details, the witness statements, the timeline of alleged abuse, the public fallout, and the fight for justice are still ahead. When a crime of this magnitude hits a community, the first wave is always shock. The second is questions. And in the aftermath of Sam Nordquist's death, investigators, journalists, and the public all wanted answers. How long had Sam been suffering? What exactly happened inside that house? And how close did the world come to saving him before it was too late? Tonight, in part 2, we go inside the investigation. Inside the interviews. Inside the timeline. Inside the evidence that painted one of the darkest pictures investigators in Minneapolis had seen in years. Let's continue. When paramedics arrived at the house on April 26, 2025, the situation was chaotic. The 911 caller described Sam as unresponsive. Medical staff quickly realized this wasn't a routine call. Sam had injuries that raised immediate suspicion, and hospital personnel contacted law enforcement almost instantly. Police arrived at the hospital within minutes. And that was the moment the case shifted from medical emergency to potential homicide investigation. Detectives began asking questions, and the answers didn't make sense. It's important to tread carefully here, because not everyone present in that house was accused of the same actions, and everyone is legally presumed innocent until proven guilty. But what detectives encountered were conflicting stories, changing details, and explanations that didn't fit the severity of Sam's injuries. Some individuals in the home claimed Sam had fallen. Some said Sam injured himself. Others said they didn't know what happened at all. But the medical examiners knew better. The trauma they observed was not consistent with a fall. Not consistent with a single blow. Not consistent with an accident. The injuries suggested something prolonged, repeated, deliberate, and investigators now had the most essential element of any major case: reasonable suspicion. Later that same day, detectives secured search warrants for the residence. The moment they stepped inside, the scene raised even more questions. The house was cluttered, dim, chaotic. There were signs of struggle in several areas. Scuff marks, knocked over furniture, suspicious stains, and discarded personal items. But beyond the physical environment, investigators were struck by what wasn't there. No signs of a recent medical emergency. No signs that anyone in the house had tried to help Sam until it was far too late. What they found was a space where a vulnerable person could have been hidden and hurt without anyone outside realizing what was happening. This was the beginning of a difficult but crucial timeline-building process. Detectives now needed to determine not only how Sam died, but when the abuse may have started, and who exactly was responsible for each piece of that suffering. The timeline investigators built was not simple. It relied on dozens of interviews, text messages, witness statements, digital footprints, phone records, and evidence gathered from the home. Based on these sources, authorities came to believe Sam's final month was filled with repeated physical mistreatment. The exact details remain part of ongoing legal processes, and we will not exaggerate or speculate, but investigators described a period of sustained injury. Not a single moment, but a pattern. They believed Sam was unable to leave the home. They believed he was isolated. They believed he was mistreated repeatedly. And every new piece of evidence made the picture more horrifying. As investigators pieced together the timeline, one detail stood out above all others, a detail that caused both public fury and deep institutional soul-searching. The welfare check. As we discussed in Part 1, Sam's mother had contacted police weeks earlier, begging them to check on her son. Officers indeed went to the house. They knocked. No one opened the door. And then they left. Case closed. But Sam was inside, alive, and, according to investigators, suffering. Had that welfare check been handled differently? Had officers insisted on entry? Had they returned later? Had someone pushed a little harder? Sam might have survived. This isn't speculation. This is the painful conclusion many have drawn from the official timeline. And it became one of the major factors in the public outcry that followed. As the truth came out, community members began speaking to media outlets. Neighbors described strange noises, people coming and going at odd hours, arguments, shouting. Some said they thought about calling police. Others said they didn't want to get involved. But collectively, their statements painted a picture. This house had been sending warning signals for a long time, signals no one fully acted on. Advocates pointed out that marginalized people, including transgender individuals like Sam, often fall through the cracks of social systems and community vigilance. People assumed someone else would help Sam. Someone else would call. Someone else would intervene. But no one did. When the autopsy was completed, it confirmed what investigators already feared. Sam's injuries were severe. They were extensive. And they were consistent with a prolonged period of physical abuse. The medical examiner determined that the trauma Sam suffered ultimately led to his death. While the exact injuries were not all publicly disclosed, and we will not sensationalize graphic details, the report established the foundation prosecutors needed to pursue serious charges. This was no accident. This was no misunderstanding. This was violence. In the days following Sam's death, multiple individuals from the home were arrested. Some were charged with murder. Some with kidnapping. Some with aiding an offender. Different charges for different alleged levels of involvement. And at the center of it all, a young man who had trusted the wrong people. It's important to state again, charges are not convictions. Each person charged has the right to defend themselves in court. But the charges demonstrated one thing clearly. Investigators believed a group of adults was responsible for Sam's suffering and death, in varying degrees. And now the public wanted justice. Interrogations are where stories break open, where lies begin to crack, where truth and deception go head-to-head. Some interviewees claimed Sam had been injured accidentally. Others said they weren't home when Sam was hurt. Some blamed each other. Some changed their stories. Detectives noted inconsistencies, words that didn't match evidence, timelines that didn't align, injuries that could not be explained away. Piece by piece, the investigation team built a picture of what they believed happened inside that house throughout April. And with each new detail, the case grew darker. One of the most heartbreaking elements police uncovered was this. There were multiple opportunities for someone in that house to call for help. Sam was injured. He was deteriorating. And days passed before anyone dialed 911. Why did they wait? Fear? Negligence? A desire to hide what was happening? A belief that he would get better on his own? These questions remain unanswered, and may never be answered. But what's clear is this: had help been called earlier, Sam might still be alive. Those minutes, those hours, those days were the difference between life and death. As news headlines spread across Minnesota, and eventually across the country, a wave of public grief and outrage rolled through the transgender community, through victims' advocacy groups, through neighbors, through lawmakers. People demanded to know, how did the welfare check fail so catastrophically? What systems allowed this to happen? Who would be held accountable, not just inside the House but outside it? Activists called for reforms in how welfare checks are conducted, especially for vulnerable adults. Some demanded additional training for responding officers. Others demanded investigations into whether prejudice, conscious or unconscious, played any role in the response. There were vigils, posters, rallies, fundraisers for Sam's mother, murals and memorials honoring Sam's life. Sam was no longer just a victim. He was becoming a symbol, a reminder of how fragile a life can be when society overlooks someone who needs protection. Despite months of investigation, many questions still remain. Who inflicted which injuries? Who stood by and did nothing? Who wanted to help but was too afraid? Were there opportunities for escape? Could Sam have signaled for help if someone had looked more closely? And perhaps the hardest question of all, why did no one stop it? These questions are now in the hands of prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, and juries. The legal process will determine guilt or innocence. Our goal here is not to pass judgment, only to understand the human story behind the headlines. But even as the investigation unfolded, one thing became painfully clear. Sam's story was far from over. Not for his family, not for his community, not for the city that failed to protect him. When a tragedy strikes, it leaves behind more than grief. It leaves behind questions, anger, change, and sometimes a legacy far larger than the life that was taken. As we move into part 3, the final chapter of this story, we step out of the crime scene and into the aftermath. Into the courtrooms, the streets, the vigils, the conversations that Sam Nordquist's death ignited across the country. This is not just the ending of a case. This is the beginning of a movement. Let's begin. In the days following Sam's passing, Minneapolis was quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the heavy quiet that follows something devastating. News outlets ran headlines. Social media filled with posts mourning Sam, demanding justice, and sharing resources for vulnerable LGBTQ+ individuals. People who had never met Sam felt the loss deeply, because in his story, many saw the pain of a community that had been ignored too many times. A community tired of being unseen, tired of being unheard, tired of burying their loved ones. Sam's mother, heartbroken and furious, began speaking publicly. She didn't want her son remembered only for the violence he endured. She wanted him remembered for the joy he brought into the world. And she wanted accountability. It started with a few candles, then flowers, then handwritten letters taped to streetlights. Within days, a makeshift memorial appeared outside the house where Sam had spent his final weeks. People gathered, holding signs that read, "Justice for Sam. Protect trans lives. No more lost voices." Some stood silently. Some prayed. Some cried openly, unable to contain the sadness of a life taken too soon. Local artists painted murals of Sam. Not of him in pain, but of him smiling, alive, light in his eyes. And at a large candlelight vigil in downtown Minneapolis, hundreds gathered. The crowd glowed in orange and gold. Speakers told stories not just of Sam, but of the countless other transgender individuals whose names never made it to the headlines. That night, a city mourned, but it also united. While the community mourned, city officials were facing enormous pressure. People wanted to know, how did the welfare check fail? The question echoed across social media, newsrooms, and city council meetings. Police representatives stated that officers followed standard protocol during the welfare check. But critics argued that the situation demanded more, especially given the vulnerability of the individual involved. Some activists pointed out long-standing concerns about how police interact with marginalized communities. Others demanded changes to welfare check procedures. More training, mandatory follow-ups, clearer guidelines on when forced entry is appropriate. The city announced an internal review. Advocacy groups demanded an external investigation as well. Sam's death was no longer just a crime story. It was a turning point. As weeks passed, the legal process began. Court hearings started, some public, some behind closed doors. Defendants appeared in front of judges, some seeking lower bail, some requesting additional legal counsel. Prosecutors laid out early versions of their theory of the case, based on evidence collected from the house, witness interviews, and the autopsy. Defense attorneys pushed back, arguing that not all allegations were supported by the evidence, that roles differed among defendants, and that some individuals had no intent to harm. These opening moves set the tone. This would be a long, difficult legal battle. But one thing was clear: the state was taking the case seriously. Very seriously. Sam's family attended hearings when they could. Sometimes they sat quietly. Sometimes they cried. Sometimes they left early, unable to handle the emotional weight. No parent is ever prepared to sit in a courtroom and listen to the details of how their child died. While the legal system moved slowly, the public conversation moved quickly. Advocates began pushing for improved welfare check protocols, mandatory follow-up visits when a vulnerable person may be at risk, training for officers on LGBTQ+ awareness and vulnerable populations, better crisis intervention programs, community-based alternatives for checking on at-risk individuals. City council meetings filled with speakers demanding changes. Some shared their own stories of failed welfare checks. Others talked about the fear transgender people often feel when dealing with institutions that are supposed to protect them. Sam's name became part of a broader call for change, a symbol around which people rallied. As the weeks went on, Sam's story began spreading across the country. Major outlets ran features. Commentators discussed the vulnerabilities transgender individuals often face. Advocates used Sam's case to highlight the urgent need for systemic reforms. Online, Sam's memory became part of a broader movement. Hashtags with his name trended. People created artwork, videos, and posts dedicated to him. Sam was no longer just a local tragedy. He was part of a national conversation about safety, accountability, and compassion. Among all the voices that filled the public space, one stood out: Sam's mother. She shared her guilt, not because she failed her son, but because she felt the system failed her. She had called for help. She had begged for a welfare check. She had done everything a parent could do. And still, Sam died alone, injured beyond recognition, in a place where he should never have been. Her grief became a driving force behind calls for reform. She spoke about Sam with love, with heartbreak, and with a resolve that he would not be forgotten. Her strength moved people. Her pain motivated them. Justice is a complicated word in cases like this. Is it prison sentences? Is it public accountability? Is it reform? Is it remembrance? For Sam's family, justice meant all of the above. They wanted the people responsible for his suffering held accountable. They wanted apologies for the failed welfare check. They wanted change so no other family would endure the same nightmare. Justice, in Sam's case, was both legal and societal. It wasn't just about what happened inside a courtroom. It was also about what happened in the hearts and minds of the public. Sam didn't live long enough to see the impact his life would have. But in the months following his death, something remarkable began to happen. Community groups started safety networks for vulnerable LGBTQ+ individuals. Organizations began offering training sessions on recognizing signs of abuse. Local shelters expanded services for transgender clients. Neighbors began checking on each other more. In his absence, Sam brought people together. He made people pay attention. He made people care. His story became a reminder of how easily someone can slip into danger, and how important it is to stay connected, to notice, to intervene, to speak up. Sam's legacy wasn't defined by the violence he endured. It was defined by the light he sparked afterward. As we end this three-part story, we reflect on a life lost far too soon. A life filled with humor, gentleness, and quiet resilience. Sam Nordquist was not a headline. He was not a symbol. He was not a case file. He was a human being, a son, a friend, a young man who deserved love, safety, and protection. A young man who deserved more from the world than what he received. And while we cannot change what happened, we can ensure his memory leads to awareness, vigilance, and compassion. We can create a world where the vulnerable are seen, where welfare checks are taken seriously, where people step in instead of stepping away, where no one suffers in silence. Sam's story is tragic, but it can also be transformative, can inspire change, can save lives. It can remind us that we all have a responsibility to protect one another. And that is how Sam lives on,